The great hall of the Galactic Court of Justice stretched high above the gathered crowd, like a crystal mountain reaching toward the stars. The walls shimmered with a strange blue light that danced and moved like water, but held solid as stone. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy filled the seats that rose in curved rows around the central platform, where justice was supposed to happen. Commander Jake Sullivan sat in the prisoner dock with heavy energy chains around his wrists and ankles. The chains glowed red and made a soft humming sound that reminded him of angry bees. His military uniform was torn and stained with blood from the battle that brought him here. His brown hair was messy and his face showed 3 days without shaving, but his green eyes stayed sharp and alert. The aliens in the courtroom looked at him like he was some kind of dangerous animal in a cage. Some had 6 legs and fur like giant cats. Others had skin that changed colors when they moved. A few looked almost human, but with too many fingers or eyes that were completely black. They whispered to each other in sounds that Jake could not understand even with his translation device. At the front of the room sat Magistrate Veltar on a throne made of what looked like living metal. She was 12 feet tall with a body like a giant ant, but walking on 2 legs instead of 6. Her head was triangle-shaped with huge compound eyes that reflected the room like broken mirrors. When she moved her head, the light scattered in all directions like tiny rainbows. The prosecutor stood near a table covered with evidence boxes and data screens. Advocate Prindal was a snake-like creature with green scales that seemed to move on their own. His body was 8 feet long, and he had arms but no legs. When he spoke, his forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. He wore robes of deep purple. That marked his high rank in the court system. Prindal began speaking in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. The translation device in Jake's ear turned his words into English, but kept the cold tone that made Jake's skin crawl. The prosecutor told the court about the crime Jake was accused of. He had destroyed a Zephyrian diplomatic ship called the Peace Bearer. 43 alien diplomats had died in the explosion. The ship had been on a mission to negotiate peace between the Zephyrian Empire and the human colonies. Jake listened to the lies and felt his hands tighten into fists. The energy chains sparked against his skin, but he did not move. He had learned to stay still during his 3 years as a prisoner waiting for this trial. The evidence seemed to prove everything Prindal claimed. Computer records showed Jake's ship firing first. Video recordings from other ships showed the Peace Bearer exploding in a ball of white fire. Witness statements from 3 different alien species all said the same thing. The humans had attacked without warning during what should have been a peaceful meeting. Even Jake's own communications log showed him giving the order to fire. His voice came through the courtroom speakers, clear and strong, saying the words that would probably send him to prison for the rest of his life. "Fire all weapons at the Zephyrian vessel. Do it now!" The aliens in the gallery made sounds that Jake's translator could not turn into words, but he knew they were laughing at him. Some pointed at him with tentacles or claws or whatever they used, for hands. A few made gestures that Jake was pretty sure meant the same thing in any language. Bet makers from across the galaxy had set odds of 10,000 to 1 against any human winning a case in this court. No human lawyer had ever successfully defended anyone here. Most species considered humans too primitive to understand galactic law. They thought humans were driven by emotions instead of logic, and that made them unpredictable and dangerous. Jake had heard all of this during his time in prison. The guards had made sure he knew how hopeless his situation was. They told him that humans were barely evolved animals who had gotten lucky with space travel. They said his species would be extinct within 100 years because they could not adapt to civilized galactic society. But Jake knew something that the prosecution and the laughing aliens did not know. The truth about what really happened that day when he destroyed the Peace Bearer. The truth about what the Zephyrians were really doing in human space. The truth about why he had no choice but to fire first and save the 30,000 human colonists on New Haven. The problem was proving it. The evidence had been carefully arranged to tell one story and hide another. The witnesses had been chosen for what they saw and what they did not see. The computer records had been edited to remove the most important parts. Jake looked up at Magistrate Veltar and wondered if any alien could understand what it meant to be human. Could they understand the weight of making a choice that would save lives but destroy your own future? Could they understand choosing to be called a war criminal if it meant children would live to see another day? The prosecutor finished his opening statement with a request that Jake be sentenced to life imprisonment on the prison planet Zerion, where the gravity was 3 times Earth normal and the air burned human lungs. The aliens in the gallery made more of those untranslatable sounds that meant they approved. Jake closed his eyes and thought about his sister Lisa, who had volunteered to defend him when no one else would take the case. She should be walking through those doors any minute now to begin what everyone considered an impossible task. Everyone except Jake, who knew that humans had one advantage that none of these advanced alien species possessed. They never gave up. The massive doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Every alien in the gallery turned to look as a small human woman walked into the hall. She wore a simple black suit that looked plain and boring next to all the fancy robes and ceremonial clothes worn by the alien lawyers. Her brown hair was pulled back tight, and her blue eyes looked straight ahead as she walked down the long aisle toward the front of the court. Lisa Morgan carried only a single data pad in one hand and an old leather briefcase in the other. The briefcase was worn and scratched from years of use. It had belonged to her grandfather, who was a trial lawyer back on Earth before humans ever left their home planet. She had brought it with her across the galaxy as a reminder of where she came from. The aliens in the gallery began making sounds that the translation devices turned into laughter and mockery. Some of the creatures were so amused they had to hold onto their seats to keep from falling over. A group of tall blue beings with 4 arms pointed at Lisa and made clicking sounds that meant they found her appearance ridiculous. Advocate Prindal raised his snake-like body higher, and his scales shimmered with what his species showed when they felt superior to someone else. His forked tongue flicked out several times as if he was tasting something pleasant in the air. He leaned over to another prosecutor and whispered something that made both of them make the hissing sound that meant laughter for their kind. Even Magistrate Veltar seemed amused by what she saw. The giant ant-like judge's antennae twitched, in a pattern that other members of her species would recognize as mild entertainment. Her compound eyes reflected Lisa's small form hundreds of times as the human lawyer approached the defendant's table. Lisa ignored all of the attention and walked straight to where her brother sat in his energy chains. Jake looked up at her with a mixture of relief and worry. He was glad to see a friendly face, but he knew what this case could do to her career. If she lost here, and she probably would, her reputation as a lawyer would be destroyed. No human court would trust her judgment after failing in such a public way. Lisa sat down next to Jake and opened her briefcase. Inside were paper documents along with the electronic files. She still used paper because it could not be hacked or changed remotely, like computer files could. Her grandfather had taught her that the most important evidence should always exist in a form that could not be altered. She spoke to Jake in a low voice that the alien spectators could not hear over their own noise. She asked him if he was ready, and if he understood what they were about to attempt. Jake nodded and told her he trusted her completely. She had always been the smart one in their family, and she had never let him down when they were children growing up on the farming colony where their parents worked. Lisa had been a military lawyer for 5 years before she left the service to practice civilian law on Earth. She understood military procedure and the kind of decisions that officers had to make in combat situations. When Jake was arrested and no other lawyer would take his case, she had volunteered immediately. The military had tried to talk her out of it, but she refused to abandon her brother. Now she stood up to address the court for the first time. The phrase, Laughter and mockery grew louder as the aliens saw how small she was compared to all of them. Lisa was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, which made her tiny next to beings that were 8 or 10 or 12 feet in height. Some of the aliens had natural armor plating or multiple heads or other features that made them look like monsters from human nightmares. The Zephyrian delegation sat in a special section reserved for the victims of the alleged crime. They were tall and thin with pale skin and large black eyes that never seemed to blink. Their faces showed no expression, but their posture radiated anger and the desire for revenge against the human who had killed their diplomats. Lisa waited for the noise to die down before she began speaking. When she opened her mouth, the words came out in perfect galactic standard without any accent or pronunciation errors that might mark her as primitive or uneducated. She had spent 2 years learning the language and studying galactic law to prepare for this moment. Her voice carried clearly through the great hall, even though she did not shout or raise her tone. She looked directly at Magistrate Veltar as she spoke, which was considered proper court protocol. Some of the alien spectators stopped laughing when they realized she knew the correct procedures. Lisa began with the traditional opening that all defense attorneys used in galactic court. She acknowledged the wisdom of the judges and the authority of the court. She promised to present evidence truthfully and to respect the ancient laws that governed all civilized species. But then she said something that made the entire courtroom go quiet. She told Magistrate Veltar that her client was completely innocent of all charges. The destruction of the Zephyrian ship was not only legal under interstellar law, but was necessary to prevent a much greater crime. She intended to prove that the court had been deliberately lied to about what really happened that day. The silence lasted for about 3 seconds before the courtroom exploded with alien voices expressing shock and disbelief. Advocate Prindal rose up on his snake-like body and objected immediately. He claimed that humans lacked the legal knowledge to understand the concepts they were trying to use. He said it was ridiculous for a primitive species to lecture their betters about galactic law. But Lisa was ready for this challenge. She began citing specific statutes and legal precedents that supported her position. She quoted case numbers and court decisions going back hundreds of years. Her knowledge was so detailed and accurate that even Prindal had to stop objecting and listen. The alien spectators grew quieter as they realized this human lawyer actually knew what she was talking about. A few of the more experienced legal observers began paying closer attention instead of treating the whole thing as entertainment. Lisa continued speaking in her calm, clear voice. She explained that she would prove 3 things during the trial. First, that the Zephyrian ship was not on a diplomatic mission as claimed. Second, that Commander Sullivan's actions were justified under the doctrine of species preservation. And third, that the real criminals in this case were the ones sitting in the victim section pretending to seek justice. When she finished her opening statement, the courtroom was completely silent. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Court of Justice, the alien observers were not sure what to expect from a human defendant. Lisa Morgan had just changed the rules of a game that everyone thought they understood. Lisa Morgan did something that had never been done before in the Galactic Court of Justice. Instead of beginning with legal arguments and evidence files, she started telling a story. She spoke about real people and real places in a way that made the alien judges lean forward in their seats to listen better. She began with the human colony called New Haven, which sat on the edge of Zephyrian space, like a small island in a vast ocean. 30,000 humans had traveled there in ships that took 2 years to cross the distance between stars. These were not soldiers or politicians, but ordinary families who wanted to build new lives on a world far from Earth. Lisa described the colonists in detail that made them seem real instead of just numbers in a report. There was old Ben Carter, who had been a teacher on Earth and now grew vegetables in soil that had never known human hands before. Sarah Kim worked as the colony's doctor and delivered the first human baby born under New Haven's 3 moons. Young Tim Brooks was only 16 but had learned to repair the fusion generators that powered the settlement. The alien spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Lisa painted pictures with her words. Galactic law usually dealt with abstract concepts like territorial boundaries and trade regulations and treaty violations. Nobody talked about individuals or families or children playing games in alien wheat fields under foreign stars. Lisa told them about harvest festivals where colonists shared food and music while their children ran between the tables laughing and playing. She described elderly couples sitting on porches to watch sunsets that painted the sky in colors that Earth had never seen. These people had left everything they knew to start over on a world where nothing was familiar except the hope for a better future. Magistrate Veltar's compound eyes seemed to focus more intently on the human lawyer as the story continued. Other judges from different species also appeared to be paying closer attention. This was not the kind of testimony they were used to hearing in their courtroom. Then Lisa's voice grew harder as she moved to the darker part of her story. She told the court what the prosecution's evidence had deliberately left out. The Zephyrian ship called Peacebearer had not been on a diplomatic mission at all. It was conducting reconnaissance for a planned military attack against New Haven Colony. Commander Sullivan's destroyer Liberty had responded to desperate calls for help from the colonists. They had discovered Zephyrian infiltrators in their settlement who were poisoning the water supply and sabotaging the defensive systems. The colonists were trapped and helpless, with no way to protect themselves against what was coming. Lisa presented evidence that Advocate Prindal had tried to keep out of the trial. Intercepted communications showed that the Zephyrians had never intended to honor their peace treaty with humanity. The Peacebearer was actually a military vessel disguised as a diplomatic ship. It carried enough biological weapons to kill every human on New Haven and leave the planet ready for Zephyrian colonization. When Prindal rose to object to this evidence, Lisa did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Instead of arguing about legal procedures or court rules, she looked directly at Magistrate Veltar and asked a simple question. She asked what the judge would do if someone came to destroy her hive and kill her offspring and erase her genetic line from existence. The question hung in the air like a challenge that demanded an honest answer instead of a legal ruling. For the first time, the alien judges began to see the conflict not as an abstract legal problem, but as a matter of survival. Lisa continued her questioning by asking each judge what they would do to protect their own people from extinction. Would they follow court procedures while their children were being murdered, or would they act to save lives? The Zephyrian delegation began making angry sounds and demanding that the judge stop this line of questioning. They claimed it was irrelevant to the legal issues in the case, but Lisa had already accomplished what she wanted. She had forced the court to think about the human perspective instead of just the legal precedents. Lisa then revealed more evidence that destroyed the prosecution's version of events. The biological weapon found on the Peacebearer was specifically designed to target human DNA. It would not harm other species, but would kill any human who breathed it within minutes. The Zephyrians had spent years developing this weapon in secret laboratories. She showed the court recordings from New Haven Colony that proved the Zephyrians had been infiltrating human space for months before the incident. They had poisoned water supplies and sabotaged communication equipment and disabled planetary defenses. The colonists had been left defenseless and cut off from any help. Commander Sullivan had received the distress call at 3 a.m. ship time. The colony's defensive grid was down. Their communication array was failing. Long-range sensors detected massive Zephyrian fleet movements toward the system. The Peacebearer had refused all attempts at communication and was broadcasting jamming, signals that would prevent any evacuation of the colony. Lisa's voice grew stronger as she described the impossible choice her brother had faced. He could follow galactic law and allow 30,000 humans to be exterminated, or he could act to save their lives and face trial as a war criminal. He had 13 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether an entire human colony lived or died. The alien judges listened in growing silence as Lisa explained what it meant to make that kind of choice. Unlike many galactic species that relied on group consciousness or predetermined response protocols, humans had to make individual moral decisions in real time. They could not consult with a hive mind or download the correct response from a central computer. Jake Sullivan had looked at the situation and decided that human lives were more important than his own career or freedom or future. He had chosen to save the colonists, even though he knew it would probably destroy his life. Lisa turned to face the Zephyrian delegation as she concluded this part of her defense. She told them that this was what they would never understand about humans. People like her brother did not just survive or follow orders or act according to their programming. They chose who they wanted to be in every moment of crisis. And Jake Sullivan had chosen not to let the Zephyrians murder innocent families. The courtroom was completely silent when she finished speaking. The alien spectators no longer seemed amused by the human lawyer. Even Advocate Prindal appeared, uncertain about how to respond to testimony that was unlike anything he had encountered before. Magistrate Veltar's antennae stopped twitching, and her compound eyes focused on Lisa with what might have been respect. For the first time in galactic legal history, the outcome of a case involving humans was not predetermined. Lisa Morgan called her first witness to the stand, and the atmosphere in the courtroom changed completely. Dr. Alan Price walked slowly to the witness chair with his shoulders bent like he was carrying an invisible weight. His gray hair was messy, and his clothes looked like he had slept in them for several days. His hands shook slightly as he placed them on the testimony scanner that would verify he was telling the truth. Dr. Price had been working on New Haven Colony as a xenobiologist, studying how human crops could grow in alien soil. He was not a soldier or a politician, but a scientist who wanted to help the colonists build a sustainable food supply. His quiet voice barely carried across the courtroom as he began to describe what he had discovered in the days before the attack. Though Zephyrian infiltrators had not just poisoned the water supply randomly, they had introduced a biological agent that was designed to weaken human immune systems and make the colonists more vulnerable to the main weapon that would be deployed later. Dr. Price had found traces of this agent in soil samples and in the blood of colonists who had become mysteriously sick. But the worst discovery came when Dr. Price analyzed tissue samples from dead Zephyrian infiltrators who had been caught and killed by colony security. Inside their bodies, he found containers of a genetically engineered virus that was specifically designed to target human DNA. The virus would not harm any other known species but would kill humans within minutes of exposure. Dr. Price explained to the court how this weapon worked. It attacked the specific genetic sequences that made humans different from other species. Once released into the atmosphere of New Haven, it would spread quickly and kill every human on the planet, while leaving all other life forms completely unharmed. The Zephyrians could then move in and claim a perfectly preserved world. The alien judges listened in growing horror as Dr. Price described the scientific precision that had gone into creating this weapon. It was not a crude bomb or energy weapon, but a carefully crafted biological tool designed for complete genocide. The Zephyrians had spent years developing it and testing it on human prisoners captured from other colonies. Advocate Prindal tried to object to this testimony by claiming it was irrelevant to the legal charges against Commander Sullivan. But Lisa countered with legal precedents that allowed evidence of genocide planning to be presented in any trial involving species survival. The court had to consider the context of Jake's actions, not just the actions themselves. Then Lisa called her most important witness. Commander Jake Sullivan stood up from his chair with the energy chains still glowing around his wrists and ankles. The chains made it difficult for him to walk, but he managed to reach the witness stand without stumbling. His voice was steady and clear as he began to tell his side of the story. Jake described receiving the distress call from New Haven at 3 a.m. ship time. The message was broken and full of static, but the fear in the colonist's voice came through clearly. They were under attack by infiltrators, and their defensive systems were failing. Long-range sensors showed Zephyrian ships moving toward the colony in attack formation. The Peacebearer had appeared on sensors 12 hours before the scheduled peace negotiations were supposed to begin. It was in the wrong position and broadcasting the wrong identification codes. When Jake's communications officer tried to contact the ship, there was no response. Instead, the Peacebearer began transmitting jamming signals that would prevent any evacuation ships from finding New Haven colony. Jake's tactical officer reported that the Peacebearer was not broadcasting diplomatic immunity codes as required by galactic law. Its weapon systems were active and its shields were raised. The ship was behaving like a military vessel preparing for combat, not like a diplomatic transport carrying peace negotiators. With the colony's defenses down and communication failing, Jake knew that 30,000 humans would die if the Peacebearer completed its mission. He had 13 minutes before the ship would reach optimal position to deploy its biological weapon. 13 minutes to decide between following the law and saving human lives. Jake's voice never wavered as he told the court about the choice he made. He authorized his weapons officer to fire on the Peacebearer with full destructive force. The alien ship exploded in seconds, taking all 43 Zephyrians aboard with it. Jake knew this action would probably end his career and his freedom, but he also knew that 30,000 colonists would live to see another day. Lisa then presented evidence that completely destroyed the prosecution's case. Computer records, recovered from the Peacebearer's wreckage, showed detailed plans for the biological attack on New Haven. The ship's database contained genetic profiles of every human colonist and calculations for the optimal dispersal pattern of the virus weapon. The records also revealed that the 43 Zephyrians aboard the Peacebearer were not diplomats at all. They were military officers specializing in biological warfare. Their mission orders specifically mentioned the elimination of human presence in that sector of space. There was no mention of peace negotiations or diplomatic contact. Even more damaging were communications between the Peacebearer and Zephyrian military command. The ship's captain had reported that the human colony was completely defenseless and ready for cleansing. He requested permission to begin the final phase of the operation that would make New Haven safe for Zephyrian settlement. Advocate Prindal attempted to argue that preemptive strikes were still violations of galactic law, regardless of the enemy's intentions. But Lisa countered with a legal precedent that no alien lawyer had ever successfully invoked. The doctrine of species preservation was an ancient statute that permitted any action necessary to prevent genocide. The doctrine had been written into galactic law after a war that nearly destroyed several species through biological weapons. It stated that any being had the right to use deadly force to prevent the extinction of their own kind. The law was rarely invoked because most species had other options when threatened, but humans on New Haven had been cut off and defenseless, with no possibility of escape or rescue. Lisa argued that Jake Sullivan's actions were not only legal under the doctrine of species preservation, but were morally required. He had a duty as a military officer and as a human being to protect innocent lives from genocide. His decision to fire on the Peacebearer was the only choice that would prevent mass murder. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Zephyrians had planned and attempted genocide against human colonists. Their diplomatic mission was a lie designed to provide cover for biological warfare. Commander Sullivan had acted within galactic law to prevent the extinction of an entire human settlement. As Lisa concluded her presentation of evidence, the courtroom was silent except for the soft humming of Jake's energy chains. The alien spectators no longer looked amused or entertained. Many appeared shocked by the revelations about Zephyrian intentions and methods. Even Magistrate Veltar's compound eyes seemed to reflect the evidence screens with new understanding. For the first time in galactic legal history, a human defendant had not only proven his innocence, but had exposed the real criminals sitting in the victim section of the courtroom. Lisa Morgan activated the main display screen in the courtroom and announced that she had one final piece of evidence to present. The screen flickered to life, showing a recording recovered from the peace-bearer's wreckage moments before the ship was destroyed. The audio was clear, and the translation devices worked perfectly as the voice of Zephyrian Commander Thalek filled the Great Hall. The recording began with routine military communications, but quickly became something much darker. Commander Thalek was speaking to his subordinates about the mission they were about to complete. His voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing everyday business rather than planning mass murder. These mammals breed like insects across worlds that should belong to superior species. Today, we begin the final solution to the human problem. In this sector, the biological agent is ready for deployment and the targets are completely defenseless. We will cleanse 17 colonies before the primitive humans even realize what is happening. The alien spectators in the courtroom listened in growing shock as Thalek continued speaking. He described how the diplomatic immunity codes had provided perfect cover for positioning biological weapons throughout human space. The peace negotiations had been a clever deception that kept the humans trusting and vulnerable while genocide preparations were completed. The recording revealed that Haven was just the first target in a systematic campaign to exterminate human colonies. The Zephyrians had weapons positioned near 17 different settlements with plans to deploy them simultaneously. Over 500,000 humans would die in the first wave of attacks, with more colonies targeted for elimination in the months that followed. Thalek's voice grew excited as he explained how the biological weapons worked. The virus would kill only humans, while leaving infrastructure and resources intact for Zephyrian use. It was the perfect tool for claiming new worlds without the expense and destruction of conventional warfare. The colonies would simply become empty and ready for new inhabitants. The most horrifying part of the recording came when Thalek discussed what would happen to human children. The virus was designed to work more slowly on younger humans to ensure they experienced maximum suffering before death. This was intended to serve as a warning to any other species that might resist Zephyrian expansion in the future. Lisa stood in the center of the courtroom as the recording played and watched the faces of the alien judges change from curiosity to disgust to outrage. Even species that had little love for humans seemed disturbed by the casual cruelty in Thalek's voice. The systematic nature of the planned genocide violated every principle of civilized behavior that the galactic community claimed to uphold. When the recording ended, the courtroom was completely silent. The Zephyrian delegation sat frozen in their seats, unable to deny what everyone had just heard. Their own military commander had confessed to planning genocide while believing his communications were secure. Lisa's voice rang out clearly in the silence as she addressed the court with words that would be remembered for generations. This trial was meant to be a joke, she said. A primitive human standing before the wisdom of galactic civilization doomed to fail because her species lacked sophistication and evolution and superior understanding of law and order. But there was something the galactic community did not understand. About humans, Lisa continued. They did not fight because they were primitive or defend themselves because they were naturally violent. Humans fought because they chose to fight. When faced with extinction, they did not calculate odds or consult algorithms or seek consensus from a collective mind. They acted based on individual moral choices made in real time. Lisa turned to look directly at Commander Jake Sullivan as she spoke about what made humans different from other species. Jake had not fired on the peace-bearer because he was following orders or because he was programmed to respond in a certain way. He fired because he looked at the situation and decided that 30,000 human lives were worth more than his own career and freedom and future. The courtroom remained silent as Lisa explained what the aliens would never truly understand about humanity. Humans did not just survive like animals or follow programming like machines. They chose who they wanted to be in every moment of crisis. When Jake Sullivan was faced with an impossible decision, he chose to be someone who would not let children be murdered while he watched. Lisa walked closer to the Zephyrian delegation as her voice grew stronger. She told them that their entire plan had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. They had assumed that humans would follow legal procedures even while being exterminated. They thought human commanders would hesitate to act without proper authorization from higher authority. But Jake Sullivan had shown them what humans really were. Not primitive animals driven by emotion or advanced computers following logical programs, but moral agents who could look at any situation and choose the right action, regardless of personal consequences. That was what made humans truly dangerous to species like the Zephyrians, who relied on predictable behavior from their enemies. The evidence was now complete and undeniable. The Zephyrians had used diplomatic immunity to position weapons of mass destruction near human colonies. They had planned systematic genocide disguised as peace negotiations. They had developed biological weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering to human children. Commander Jake Sullivan had prevented this genocide by destroying one ship and killing 43 military officers who were preparing to murder 500,000 innocent people. His actions were not only legal under galactic law, but were morally required by any standard of civilized behavior. Lisa returned to her table and sat down next to her brother. The energy chains around Jake's wrists had stopped glowing and humming as if the courtroom's power systems were responding to the emotional weight of the moment. Brother and sister sat together facing a court that would now decide whether humanity would be punished for refusing to submit quietly to extinction. Magistrate Veltar's compound eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the shocked faces of alien spectators and the uncomfortable shifting of the Zephyrian delegation. The judge's antennae moved in complex patterns that her species used to process difficult information and make important decisions. The trial that was supposed to demonstrate human inferiority had instead revealed something that made the galactic community deeply uncomfortable. Perhaps the species they considered primitive was actually more evolved in the ways that truly mattered. Perhaps emotional decision-making and individual moral responsibility represented a higher form of consciousness than collective algorithms and predetermined responses. For the first time in their advanced civilization, the aliens were forced to consider whether they might be the ones who were truly primitive. Magistrate Veltar called for a recess while the judges deliberated on everything they had heard. The great hall emptied slowly as alien spectators filed out through the massive doors, talking in excited voices about the shocking revelations. Many seemed confused and disturbed by what they had learned about the Zephyrian genocide plans and the human response to those plans. Jake Sullivan remained in his energy chains during the recess, but the guards allowed Lisa to stay with him. Brother and sister sat quietly together, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just Jake's fate, but possibly the future relationship between humanity and the galactic community. Lisa felt exhausted after presenting the most important case of her career. She had revealed evidence that would change how other species viewed humans, but she still was not sure if it would be enough to save her brother's life. Galactic justice was unpredictable, and alien minds worked differently than human ones. Jake looked surprisingly calm for someone whose life hung in the balance. He told Lisa that regardless of the verdict, he was proud of what they had accomplished together. The truth about Zephyrian genocide plans was now public knowledge across the galaxy. Even if he went to prison, the 500,000 humans in those 17 colonies would be warned and protected. When court resumed 3 hours later, the alien spectators returned to find the atmosphere completely changed. News of the trial had spread across the galaxy through faster-than-light communications, and millions of beings were watching the proceedings on their homeworlds. This was no longer just a legal case, but a defining moment for galactic civilization. The judges filed back into the courtroom with Magistrate Veltar leading the procession. Her compound eyes seemed to reflect light differently than before, as if something fundamental had changed in how she saw the world. The other judges from various species also appeared subdued and thoughtful, rather than confident in their superior wisdom. Magistrate Veltar rose to her full 12-foot height, and her voice carried clearly through the hall as she began to deliver the verdict. The court had considered all evidence presented by both prosecution and defense. They had reviewed applicable laws, including the rarely invoked doctrine of species preservation. They had examined the behavior and motivations of all parties involved in the incident. The judge paused and looked directly at Jake Sullivan before continuing. This court finds Commander Jake Sullivan not guilty of all charges related to the destruction of the Zephyrian vessel Peacebearer. His actions were justified under galactic law and were necessary to prevent genocide against human colonists. The courtroom erupted in sound as alien spectators reacted to the unexpected verdict. Some species that had conflicts with humans began talking urgently among themselves about the implications. Others seemed relieved that the court had recognized the difference between legitimate military action and unprovoked aggression. But Magistrate Veltar was not finished speaking. She raised one clawed hand, and the hall grew quiet again as she continued with words that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. Furthermore, this court finds that the Zephyrian Empire violated the Galactic Peace Accords through systematic deception conspiracy to commit genocide and the use of diplomatic vessels for military purposes. The Zephyrian delegation rose from their seats in outrage as the judge continued. Their ambassador declared that his empire would not recognize the court's authority and that this verdict was invalid because it was based on fabricated evidence. But his protests were drowned out by the sound of other alien species demanding investigations into Zephyrian activities in their own territories. Magistrate Veltar ordered that all Zephyrian diplomatic vessels be searched immediately and that any biological weapons found would result in additional charges. The Empire's ambassador and his staff were placed under arrest pending further investigation. The delegation that had come expecting to see a human convicted of war crimes instead found themselves facing justice for attempted genocide. The energy chains around Jake's wrists and ankles deactivated with a soft chime and fell to the floor. He stood slowly and embraced his sister while alien spectators continued their excited discussions. Lisa had done more than save her brother's life. She had fundamentally changed how the galaxy viewed humanity and exposed the real threat to galactic peace. News of the verdict spread across space at light speed and beyond through quantum communication networks. On human colonies throughout the galaxy, people celebrated not just Jake's acquittal, but the recognition that their species deserved respect and protection under galactic law. For the first time, humans were seen as legitimate members of the galactic community rather than primitive newcomers. The trial had other immediate consequences that surprised everyone. Several alien species that had territorial disputes with humans quietly began requesting formal negotiations rather than risk similar revelations about their own aggressive plans. The threat of facing human defenders who would act decisively to protect their people made military conquest seem much less attractive. Lisa Morgan became famous overnight as news of her courtroom victory reached every civilized world. She received thousands of requests to represent other species in galactic court, but she turned down most offers. Instead, she returned to Earth to establish the first interstellar legal clinic where human lawyers could learn galactic law and alien. Lawyers could study human approaches to justice and moral reasoning. Jake Sullivan was reassigned to command the first deep space diplomatic mission representing humanity in first contact situations. His experience at New Haven and in the trial made him uniquely qualified to represent human interests when meeting new species. The military recognized that his willingness to make difficult moral choices under pressure was exactly what humanity needed in its ambassadors. 6 months after the trial, Jake found himself on another colony world where tensions between humans and aliens threatened to explode into violence. But this time when he arrived, the alien representatives already knew his reputation. They had heard about New Haven and the trial, and they understood that humans would fight if threatened with extinction. The negotiations that followed established what became known as the Sullivan Doctrine. Any species that threatened genocide against humans or any other race would forfeit all diplomatic protections and face immediate military response. The principle that emotional decision-making and individual moral responsibility might be more advanced than collective algorithms became accepted throughout civilized space. The trial that was meant to be a joke had become the foundation of a new era in galactic civilization. Humanity had earned not just respect, but something more valuable. The recognition that their seemingly primitive approach to moral choice might actually represent the highest form of consciousness that any species had achieved. The galaxy was no longer sure who the real primitives were, and that uncertainty made the universe a much more interesting and dangerous place for anyone who threatened innocent life.